Thank you, Pavel. I understand that as the speaker immediately after lunch, my job is essentially to wake everybody up, since people tend to doze off during lunch. My other task will be to make life difficult for the interpreters, because I have a tendency to speak very quickly. I do regret I have only 15 minutes to talk. In fraternal Ukraine and in Serbia, I'm allowed to talk as long as I want to, but obviously because of the oppressive conditions that prevail in Russia, I will be limited to only 15 minutes. We can talk about that later. I listened to the earlier speakers this morning, Mr. Tomchin, Mr. Lozansky, Mr. Andrews. An episode came to mind from my own experience that I had not thought of when I prepared my remarks. By the way, what I say just now will be a summary of some longer written remarks that you're welcome to have emailed to you if you're interested in seeing what else I had on this topic. But it has to do with the nexus between lobbying or government relations, PR, and other activities of this sort. And also, as Mr. Tomchin mentioned, the unhelpful role that lawyers sometimes play in this business. Now, I happen to be a lawyer myself, so I can understand how unhelpful lawyers typically are. That they focus on the law the way it is, how you comply with it, rather than thinking about how you can change circumstances. And I remember one day a few years ago, I got a call from another lawyer in my firm asking me a lot of questions under American law called the called CFIUS. It controls foreign investments in the United States. And it had to do with a port company in Dubai, in the United Arab Emirates, that wanted to buy a lot of port facilities in the United States. And this lawyer asked me many questions about how CFIUS worked and how many days was the review period, and all these very technical questions. And of course, I knew nothing about the technical answers. I simply asked, wait a minute, please explain to me. You're trying to stop this deal, right? And he said, well, yes. I said, well, why didn't you just tell people in Congress that a bunch of Arabs are taking over our ports? And he said, oh, well, I hadn't thought of that. So we told everybody, the Arabs are taking over our ports. The Arabs are taking over our ports. And all the congressmen went crazy, and the media went crazy, and it soon became clear there was no way the government would be able to approve this deal. Even though President Bush, who was the president at the time, was dedicated to this, even though his own staff was telling him it was hopeless, he kept insisting this deal would go through, and eventually he was defeated. The deal went down, and our client, which was a tiny little port company in Florida, won. Now, I can ask you, from a professional point of view, who did a better lobbying job? Because I remember that some other very well-known, very professional firms were hired by the Dubai company when the situation was hopeless, and were paid millions of dollars to try to save the situation was hopeless. They managed to liberate many millions of dollars from the client's bank account, but they lost. Meanwhile, our client, the tiny little port company in Florida, was supposed to pay us $30,000, which they never paid anyway. So who was the more successful lobbyist in that case? I can see both sides of the issue. What I want to say today connects to the relationship between the world of politics and lobbying or government relations. And you know, it's a funny thing for us English speakers, because in English the word politics and the word policy are two very different words. In Russian and many other languages, simply they're both politika. But in English, politics means the mechanisms you use to get into power, how you know, polls and campaigns and money and focus groups and things of this sort. Whereas policy is what you do after you get into power. The laws you want to pass, the regulations you're going to put in place, things for the good of the country, for the good of the people. And although there's clearly a connection between the two things, functionally they're two very different things. In a democracy, in principle, you think a party or a candidate runs based on policy consideration. This is what I'm going to do for you when I get in office, and then the electors say, yes, I like that guy better. In fact, of course, we know this is not how politics works, especially in our country, since the 1960s, we live in a very visual age. Ever since John Kennedy was elected president, they say, because Nixon did not look good during the debate. People thought his eyes looked shifty. His beard had a 5 o'clock shadow on the black and white TV. People said, I don't trust him. So Kennedy got elected. This has now been multiplied many, many times over, where candidates now appear in dozens and dozens of debates. I don't know how much you follow American politics right now, but we have a very sharp competition among Republicans to be the candidate who will challenge Mr. Obama for re-election next year. And the leading candidate is a fellow named Mitt Romney, who is he's very presidential. He's tall, he has a good head of hair, he has very standard Anglo-Saxon features, which is considered good qualifications for becoming president. One of the other top Republican contenders is a man named Herman Cain, who is very, very unusual for several reasons. One, he's an African American. Two, even more rare, he's a black Republican. There are very few black Republicans. And even more amazing, he's bald. We don't have bald presidents. We don't have bald presidential candidates. The last time we had a bald president was, elected a bald president was General Eisenhower. Unlike Russia, for example, where you alternate bald and hairy leaders ever since Alexander III. What this means is that candidates, essential to our political system is that candidates are essentially marketed. They're marketed like soap or any other consumer product, largely based on superficial considerations, and naturally this involves an awful lot of money. You need money for media, you need money for TV. Money is the fuel that makes the whole campaign system works. In addition to this, you have to add the fact that we only have two parties. It's a funny thing, by the way. The United States government is very critical of other countries, saying you don't allow in your political system other parties to enter the political competition. Try entering the political competition in the United States with a new political party. The last party successfully to pull off an significant entry into our political system was the Republican Party in the 1850s. It was the last time a party managed to break out and become a new influential American party. The other parties, and we do have many other parties, the Libertarian Party, the Constitution Party, the Green Party, and so forth. These are sort of relegated to the fringes of American politics. And that's why whenever we have elections, all we really do is end up reshuffling the relative advantage or disadvantage of the Republicans against the Democrats, or the Democrats against the Republicans. Back in the 1930s, there was a gentleman named Huey Long. He was a senator and governor from Louisiana. And he once compared American politics to a restaurant. And he said, they've got a set of Republican waiters on one side and a set of Democratic waiters on the other side. But no matter which set of waiters brings you the dish, the legislative grub is all prepared in the same Wall Street kitchen. Long was shot down in 1935. In any case, what we have then, when you look at the context in which government relations and lobbying exist in our country, is that you have a very stratified, very ossified, very locked-in two-party structure. You've got campaigns that are waged with a lot of money based largely on superficial presentation of the candidates. By the way, we are in almost permanent campaign mode in our country. Unlike other countries where the campaign period is limited by law, in our country, campaigns literally begin the day after an election. As soon as an election takes place, you can bet the next day, our next election will be November 6, 2012. I can guarantee you that on October Revolution Day of 2012, there will be already candidates lining up to see who will challenge the winner in the 2016 presidential election and also the 2014 congressional elections. Mr. Andrews covered a lot of the information that I thankfully won't have to cover about the Lobby Disclosure Act, the FARA, the Foreign Agents Registration Act, and the other acts that govern these activities. I would simply add only this, is that there has been repeated calls for reform of the system, especially after the big scandal that erupted a few years ago regarding a lobbyist named Jack Abramoff. All I can say is that the tendency, remember, who writes, as much as the professional lobbying profession like Mr. Andrews may represent, let's say, common sense reforms to the system, the people who have to enact the reforms are all the Republican and Democratic politicians who depend on the money being infused into the system. And at least it's been my experience that the more reforms there are, the greater the role of money. It used to be, for example, that if I wanted an hour and a half of a staffer's time as a lobbyist, I could take him to lunch, spend $50, and he has to listen to me for an hour or an hour and a half. After the reforms, if I even buy him a cup of coffee, I could go to jail. So instead, I have to impose on his time to go spend 10 minutes with him in his office, and you can bet as soon as I get out of that meeting, in my email inbox, there's going to be an invitation for a $1,000 fundraiser or $2,000 if it's a Senate office. So which is a better system? I like the $50 lunch better than the $1,000 fundraiser system. I'd like to give you two concrete examples from my experience, and just a few words about who I am. Unlike Mr. Andrews, who spent, I think you said, the last 30 years as a lobbyist, I've only been a lobbyist for about 12 years. I started out my career after law school as a diplomat, serving in Mexico, and then also at the Soviet desk at the State Department. And then after that, I spent about 18 years as a foreign policy advisor in the U.S. Senate to the Republican leadership. My background is more that of a policy analyst, people who looks at issues and has to tell people in the Senate or in the administration, where is Pridnestrovia anyway? Where is Nagorno-Karabakh? Because trust me, most of them have no idea. I have lobbied for the government of India on nuclear issues, for the government of the Philippines on military aid issues, governed for the Republic of China, lobbied for the Republic of China on Taiwan. I worked for Mr. Yanukovych back when he was the Prime Minister in 2003 through the Orange Revolution in 2004. I previously worked for Mr. Dmitry Rogozin when he was the head of the Rodina Party here in Russia. I worked for a political prisoner of Mikhail Saakashvili, and also on behalf of the Serbian community in Kosovo, working for Vladika Artemija Rasto-Prizrenski, the spiritual leader of the Serbian community in Kosovo. I'd like to just give two short snapshots of some of this work so you can get an example of things from my perspective. The work I did on behalf of the Serbian community in Kosovo, you have to understand, was challenging a very entrenched American policy that, as a result of several factors which I will describe to you, the United States government had already decided by March of 2006, when I began this work, what its policy was going to be in Kosovo. And that is to say that we wanted to detach Kosovo from Serbia and make it an independent country. That they wanted to accomplish that by the end of 2006. Now, we were not able to change that perspective in Washington. We're beginning, as they say in English, a day late and a dollar short, except many days and many dollars. But we were able to delay it for almost 2 years, by which time the Russian position in particular had become rock hard, which Washington did not calculate on. And that it became impossible in Serbian politics to be at all open to the prospect of losing Kosovo. As things stand now, the international situation remains one which is fundamentally still advantageous to Serbia. And the big problem is actually with the ruling coalition in Belgrade, which unfortunately is composed of collaborators with Brussels and with Washington, and is not standing up for the interests of their own country. What was I found very illustrative of that example is that it elucidated and made clear some important principles of American policy that apply to foreign lobbying. One is that you should never underestimate the degree to which various foreign lobbies can make American policy, because Americans, as a rule, do not think about the outside world all that much. What an American is essentially an American is essentially a moralist. He wants somebody to tell him who all these strange people are out there. Okay, never mind. I don't want to know who they are. Just tell me who's the good guy and who's the bad guy. If you can tell me who the good guy is and the bad guy is, that's all I need to know. So if he's the good guy, we'll give him money, and if he's the bad guy, we'll drop bombs on him. Everything will be clear. So this, unfortunately, was the case with regard to Kosovo and many other foreign policy issues having to do with the post-communist space, because there has been, for many decades in Washington, what I might call the influence of the World War II Losers Club. That there have been various ethnic lobbies in Washington representing Croatians, Albanians, Hungarians, Latvians, Baltic states, West Ukrainians. It's interesting. People from West Ukraine, from the Lviv region, Uniats, represent only about 12 to 15% of Ukraine's population, but they're 75% of the diaspora in the United States, which means the Ukrainian lobby in the United States tends to be a very anti-Russian lobby. There's another factor in American politics, and that is inertia. Like the NKVD, we never make mistakes. So once Washington makes a decision on policy, it's very, very hard to go back and say, oh, you know what? We were wrong about that. We have to change course. So this is one of the lessons in lobbying. Get there first, because when you have already formed in people's mind and committed them to a certain point of view, they're very, very unlikely to go back and change it, because that means I'd be admitting I was wrong about something. And how many politicians do you know who ever admit they were wrong about something? It almost never happens. Thirdly, if you look at American policy consistently, at least since the Afghan war with the Soviet Union, there's been one very consistent strain in American policy, and that is our support for jihadist movements around the world. Now, I know this sounds like a paradox to people, because people say, well, wait a minute, you're fighting wars in Afghanistan, in Iraq, they want to attack Iran. You have a very anti-Islamic policy, don't you? You're killing Muslims everywhere. No, that's not true. That if you look at American interventions during the post-Cold War period, with the exception of Clinton when he went into Haiti, that every one of our interventions has been packaged as helping Muslims. That George Bush Sr. went into Kuwait to help Muslims in Kuwait against Saddam Hussein. Clinton helped Muslims in Bosnia, Kosovo, Somalia. George Bush wanted to liberate Muslims in Afghanistan and Iraq. For Obama, we have Libya, maybe soon Syria. This is a very consistent part of our policy. With respect to Kosovo, for example, let me quote the words of Tom Lantos, who was at the time chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. He said this: just a reminder to the predominantly Muslim-led governments in this world that here is yet another example that the United States leads the way for the creation of a predominantly Muslim country in the very heart of Europe. This should be noted by both responsible leaders of Islamic governments, such as Indonesia, and also for jihadists of all color and hue. The United States principles are universal, and in this instance, the United States stands foursquare for the creation of an overwhelmingly Muslim country in the very heart of Europe. Now, this is a very peculiar thing. You would never have an American politician saying, we're for forming a Catholic country here, we're for forming an Orthodox country there, or a Buddhist country here. But they will say this about a Muslim country because they think they can curry favor with our friends in Riyadh and Islamabad or Cairo by saying, see, look, we're helping all these Muslims here. Don't you love us? Don't you love us? And of course, they don't love us very much at all. And fourthly, and I can't go into great detail on this because time is short, there's the element of what they call benevolent global hegemony. And this is the idea that at the end of the Cold War, the United States' historic mission was to become the predominant power on the planet in order to basically bring democracy to everybody. This takes a little bit of explanation. For those of you who know your history are aware that at the end of the Napoleonic War, there was something called the Congress of Vienna in 1915, and essentially welcomed revolutionary France back into the European political system after having disrupted it for so many years. And France was not destroyed as a power. France was instead welcomed back into the family of nations. There was something created called the concert of powers, where Russia, Britain, Austria would come to an agreement on major issues so there would be no conflict among the major powers. Now, there were wars here and there, for example, the Crimean War, but there was not anything like a general European war until we got to August of 1914. Nothing like that happened at the end of World War I. We instead had the age of ideology, the age of communism, the age of fascism, and so forth. When that finally ended in 1991, the United States was not ready to welcome back Russia into the family of nations. Instead, our idea was, we won, you lost. We are the winner, you're the loser. You will now do what we say. And this was the Russia we had under Yeltsin. This is the Russia we were happy with. And this was useful for us because Russia would do as it's told, and also because it allowed us to then become the vanguard of all progressive humanity, the midwife of history, to bestow on the rest of the world the only possible enlightened doctrine. This, unfortunately, has been the context in which we find our attitude toward Russia frozen for the last 2 decades, which is now aggravated mightily by the fact that we have Mr. Saakashvili and other lobbyists very hostile to Russia active in Washington. The only exception really being Mr. Lozansky, as he showed earlier, who's doing this on his own. I can tell you, for example, there was a major anti-Russian conference at the Heritage Foundation on October 25th. It was just one long hate Russia, hate Putin session. And there was somebody there from one of the PR firms that is employed by the Russian government, and one of my colleagues asked him, so what are you doing to counteract all this? And his answer was, nothing. Now, there's some people who take the view that, well, Russia doesn't need to do that. Russia is a major power. They don't need to be concerned about these things. And my view is that based on my Serbian experience, yeah, you do have to care about these things. As even Yeltsin said in 1999, if we did not have nuclear weapons, we would already be treated like Serbia. This is a problem. Let me tell you seriously, folks, this is a huge problem. It's a problem for the Russian government. It's a problem for Russian business. And it's something that I think is detrimental to my own country because it encouraged us to do stupid things in the world at a time when we certainly cannot afford it and when we should be working together with Russia instead of trying to push Russia into a corner. Thank you.